All right, hello people, and this is going to be the last video in this particular playlist, unless good old Dr. Dave suddenly comes up with an appendix or an extension for his book, of course. And what am I doing in this one? We are literally going to do a very quick recap, the first 3 or 4 moves of each variation, whiz back through the book. Why? Just as a reminder, because it might be useful. Also, as for somebody that hasn't got time to watch all 38 and 37, whatever it is, episodes, they can have a quick look at this. And also a little bit of a bonus at the end, which may or may not come in useful. So what did we do? Well, the first thing that Dr. Dave recommends is we play e4 as white. I'm going to leave the computer on all the time here. And so we looked at everything that could possibly happen, or everything sensible that could possibly happen. Let's just say if black does odd things like the old St. George defense and stuff like that, just develop sensibly, occupy the center, and you're going to be absolutely fine. Against this particular one, you play a4 actually and just completely annoy black early. But against weird stuff, just occupy the center, fine. And develop your pieces, get castle, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at more sensible moves. So against e5, Dr. Dave recommends knight to f3. And we looked at some different things for this. We had the very traditional knight to c6, so the Scotch game, and then the Scotch game was recommended as a possibility, I should say. So that's a very quick d4. And after pawn takes, you then have some different options. Bishop c4 is a distinct possibility, which we looked at, so maybe quickly targeting up here. And we also looked at the possibility of the Scotch Gambit, which involves playing maybe c3 and completely gambiting away a pawn. So let's say knight f6. And perhaps not in this position, but this kind of thing here and here. But that's not necessarily the right time to do it, but you can see it's still pretty level. So in short, against this, very quick, d4 is a possibility. We also looked at, if you want something else and something a bit safer, a bit more solid, bishop c4. Various things cropped up. We looked at the possibility of the Evans Gambit. So bishop c5 is a possibility that will come up quite a bit. And you can play b4. And go into all of this stuff, distracting the bishop from the middle of the board. So you've given up a pawn, and the bishop is going to go to various different places. Look where the computer's recommending it might go there, might go there, might go there. All pretty level, but pretty sharp stuff. And then you're going to get castled. You're going to play d4. You've basically given up a pawn for open lines and a big center. Interesting stuff. And the computer says pretty level chances. What else have we got in this position? I do believe we looked at the possibility of c3 here. So the classic gioco piano Italian game. So c3 again with the idea of a quick d4. So you're probably going to get, well, the computer's recommending queen f6, which is interesting. But in any case, slight advantage to white, says the computer in this position. It's interesting, isn't it? Knight f6, I was going to say, I thought that looked a bit high, and now we're back to a more normal plus 0.4. Knight f6, you might be able to play d3 if you want to just be safe, but d4, really going for it in the middle of the board. So attacking this bishop, and you're probably going to get pawn takes pawn. Maybe you can sacrifice here. You don't recapture. You might play e5. And it all gets quite complicated, quite exciting. So that's another possibility. We looked at as well the Molar Attack. Let's just find one of those. Go back to here. So bishop to c5, c3. Whoops, excuse me. c3, knight to f6, d4. ed4, cd4, and actually going for this after bishop to b4, check, knight c3, and knight takes e4, and giving up material again for quick development. So castles So you can see here, black's got 7 pawns, white's got 6 pawns, but look what the computer thinks. The computer actually thinks a pretty level game, but maybe in some lines, white actually is fractionally better. So there's that possibility. So lots and lots and lots of possibilities. If we go back a few moves here, go back a little bit, black doesn't have to play their bishop out. We looked at knight to f6 as a possibility, and we avoided doing this and going for the really complicated fried liver variation and just looked straight away at an early d4, classic theme from Dr. Dave in these situations. And so I'm just looking at the game, just sort of flicking through as we go. Takes here, here, and goodness me, it's all very complicated stuff. Still quite level, still quite playable. But yeah, you can see where we're going. So that pretty much got us through the e4, e5 stuff. So we'll go back to this a few moves. Now, of course, black doesn't have to play the knight out and go for all this stuff. There's other options. The next one that we looked at was called the Petrov Defense, and that's where black plays knight to f6. And again, because Dr. Dave, I think, has tried to recommend similar ideas all the time, we go for d4. You can play knight e5 in the Petrov, but d4 was the recommended idea. Knight takes is the sort of standard move. Bishop to d3 to attack the knight. Black defends. If the knight goes back, pawn takes pawn is just going to be quite good for white. And now knight takes pawn, and the game goes on. Typical opening, pretty level, maybe the tiniest of tiny edges for white, just based on the fact that they're a move ahead, but that's pretty level. So that was the Petrov defense. We had a look at some other strange things. We had a look at the Elephant Gambit, which it isn't great for black, but it does have some tricks to it. And you can see the computer saying whichever way you take the pawn, slight advantage to white, but just be a little careful. Personally, I would probably play knight takes e5, but the computer is saying pawn takes, and so did Dr. Dave. So I guess actually he gave one game with knight takes e5 as well, but they're both very, very useful for white. Either that or that. Okay. We looked at something else here. We looked at the Latvian Gambit, which again, if white knows what they're doing, is perfectly good for white. Slight advantage to white if they know what they're doing. And Dr. Dave recommends the knight takes e5 line. And queen f6 is probably, well, it just is black's best move. And then d4 as white. I used to play the Latvian a lot as black, and I assure you that is the best option. d6 will happen. The knight should go back. c4 is the most typical place for it. And after pawn takes, knight to c3, queen to g6. This is actually okay. The best move is to play f3, exactly as the computer's suggesting, but there's a few other things you can do as white, nothing to be scared of there. Okay, what else did we have? We also had a quick look at Philidor's defense, so playing d6, and this is very solid for black. It's okay, nothing wrong with it at all, as you can see. The usual thing, tiniest of tiny pluses for white, but Dr. Dave recommends the standard thing that he does. Early d4 and going from there. So for example, let's say, I don't know, let's say takes, could probably play queen takes or knight takes or bishop c4. So this is a classic move from the Dr. Dave repertoire, but anything that's sensible is going to be absolutely fine. And white's just slightly better here because their center pawn is a bit better than black's center pawn. White's bishops are free to go. Black's got a bishop that's a bit stuck. And of course, white's a move ahead. But, you know, pretty level, still pretty level. So nothing wrong with that. Okay, I'm just flicking through the book. The next thing we went to was a completely different system. So this time we looked at what to do with the Scandinavian defense, or the center counter, as it's sometimes called. And Dr. Dave recommends a very sort of various ways to do it. Actually, we saw some different games here. here. And Dr. Dave suggested knight to c3 in most of the games, and the queen will go here or here, and then just d4 and get developed. This again, it's perfectly okay for both sides. Will be a slight advantage to white as usual from the openings if they're sensible, but nothing wrong with this. Just remember, if black plays queen across, d4, sensible moves. At some point, bishop to d2 will be handy if you're, because you can point it at the queen. But yeah, perfectly good game for both sides. So that was the Scandinavian. Just whizzing my way through here to see which one was next. There were a lot of Scandinavian games. Okay, the next one that we looked at was the Sicilian Defense, and we wanted to avoid all of the just thousands, literally thousands of books on what happens after knight f3. And so Dr. Dave recommends the Alpine Sicilian, which basically involves getting an early d4. And as you can see from the analysis, absolutely nothing wrong with it. Moves will be played like d5. You could actually play e5, but I think takes, queen takes, d4, and chess to be played. Interesting position. Nice bit of tension in the center. Maybe the black queen is a bit in an odd spot, but the minute you can't put your knight there to take advantage of it. Computer's suggesting takes, and you've got the isolated queen's pawn. So we saw in our videos, the advantage of that is a nice basis for attack. You might be able to put your rooks on the open files either side of it. But the downside is that in an endgame, it can't be protected by other pawns. So it's quite an imbalanced game. We like imbalanced games. It means chess to be played. And you can see slight advantage to white, says the computer, but basically level. Okay. So that was how we was suggested that we deal with the Sicilian. We play c3, we play the Alpine variation. Okay, let's keep going. The next one that we looked at was called the Karakan Defense. Here, very, very solid for black, and Dr. Dave has a recommendation, d4, d5, and his recommendation is takes, and the Panov-Botvinnik attack. So a very quick c4. This is a bit of a theme in Dr. Dave's opening repertoire. Watch, by the way, pawn takes, bishop takes, once again, same as we just said in the Alpine, the possibility of the isolated queen's pawn position. So that's what we're suggesting against the Panov-Botvinnik attack. You're probably going to find more often than not that you're going to get this. You're going to get, I would think, well, the computer was quite liking c5. I was going to say that bring the two knights out. I'm guessing e6, knight c6 will be the top moves. Yeah, let's just play e6. Presumably knight f3 is going to be up there. Yeah, a3, d5, knight f3. Yep, so just typical sensible stuff. And you're absolutely fine playing as white against the Karakan. Okay. Just flicking very quickly through the pages. There was quite a bit of Karakan. Then Dr. Dave recommended we didn't recommend it, came across something else, suggested that what do we do against the Latvian Defense? And the suggestion is that we play the traditional main line. You can do this in either order, but I personally would do c4 first, just because it's a bit more forcing. So the knight will have to go back. d4 will be played, and if black knows what they're doing, they're going to play d6. And for move 5, Dr. Dave recommends the exchange variation, and you've just got a nice center, get developed, get castled, and you should have a pretty good game. You can see from the analysis, computer is pretty happy with life as white. So, okay. What else did we have? I think the next one that we had to look at was probably the Petrov Defense. And the modern and variations thereof. So that involves black doing g6, d6, bishop g7, and knight f6. And what did we get recommended against this? Well, let's just see the very first game, the first few moves. Knight to f3, excuse me, knight to c3. And the bishop e3 system, I think if memory serves, d6, yeah, the bishop e3 system, absolutely fine. Computer will tell you this is very nice. Lots of other things white can do. White could play f4 and put the knight behind. which is very nice. White could play queen here and try to put the bishop up on this square. If you've watched the videos, you'll remember that later in the game, swapping off this bishop is potentially good. And that means you could even castle queenside. So this sort of setup is recommended by Dr. Dave against the Pietz, Perk, and the Modern. I think the next one must have been the French defense, just flicking through. Yes, French defense as white. So the French defense is actually what Dr. Dave recommends as black. But if you're playing white and your opponent does this, Dr. Dave recommends something a little unusual, but very, very good. And you remember what we did against the Karakan, same against the French, the Monte Carlo variation. And again, it's give the computer a chance to think it through. There we go. And it will tell you this is perfectly good for white. We're not worried about the bishop check because knight here takes, and we're actually pretty happy with our center. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And if black plays pawn takes pawn, we can just take straight back. And what have we got? Once again, isolated queen's pawn position, and we all know nothing wrong with that. And we should have some idea of what we do. Basis for operations, use the open files, and try not to let white swap off pieces and get to an endgame when this pawn will be weak. So Monte Carlo variation against the French defense. Okay. All right, flicking through. Now, what happens if that's covered pretty much everything? So now we have to have a new board and we flip it around. And what does Dr. Dave recommend we do as black? Well, what's recommended is the French defense, funnily enough. And the first thing to say is that if white is another Dr. Dave fan and wants, and we play against c4, we don't mind that. Again, just let the computer think. Remember, as black, you should expect, if white plays properly, that white will come out of the opening with this tiniest of tiny edges. I mean, this is just level anyway. 0.05 just means the game is level chances. So we're quite happy to play against the Monte Carlo from both sides. The normal exchange variation, and white might play moves like bishop d3, just develop your pieces and get castled. There's really, I might not put it there. I might put it on e7. I might put it on d6. Castles. There's nothing to be afraid of here as black. Again, same sort of thing. Tiniest of tiny edges for white in an otherwise level game. That's typical. What else did we have going back? d5, if white plays here, we're looking to play the classical variation, which will probably, the computer will in a minute say e5. Yep, that's the most typical move. It's actually suggesting you can swap and go into the exchange, but e5, knight here, and get c5 played before you bring this knight out. Do not put this knight here before you've developed this pawn. And so let's just play a couple of moves. Let's just assume, I don't know, let's play a move. Bishop e3, c5, straight away. Okay, unless there's a very good reason not to play it, c5 in the French defense. Similarly, a more experienced white player might not play knights, might not play the knight here because they might want to avoid the Vinower variation. So you'll get a white player play knight to d2 instead, because now bishop here is met with the pawn going forward. And in this situation, you can do the same thing. You can play knight f6, provoke the pawn move, and then play c5 very quickly. Or I'm pretty confident in this position, you can actually play c5 immediately. And it's all very nice. Just if I just chuck some moves on the board, once again, we've got an isolated queen's pawn position and a pretty level game on the board. Other things that white can do: advanced variation, immediately c5, c3, and we're going to put our queen here, our knight here, and generally try to hit this pawn. This will become where all the action is. And you might, remember some of the games we saw, be able to play f6. So you really hit at this white center and try to break it up. I think that's pretty much everything that we can look at on the French defense. So that was us playing against e4 as black. Now, what if white doesn't play e4? What about other moves? Well, Dr. Dave gave us some systems for this. And the first system he gave us was the Tarash. So this looks a little bit like the French. Now, the most typical move for white here traditionally is c4, but playing it these days, you might get the London, you might get knight f3. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference. You can basically play the same kind of first three moves, and c5's coming. Here it comes. It's okay to play c5, the Tarash. Okay, and once again, big clash early in the middle of the board. All these pawns, look at this, looking at each other in the middle of the board. Lots of open lines, potentially lots of tension in the middle of the board. And again, look at that, pretty level. I should say again, this has potential to end up being an isolated queen's pawn position again as well, by the way. There it is. There she blows, as they used to say in the Navy. Let's see a whale at sea. There she blows. Yeah. If you don't want to do that, there's the alternative as well. Another setup that Dr. Dave gave us is to delay c5 for the time being and just go for normal kind of development and play what's called the Tartakova system. We're quite happy after takes. Life is good. More often than not, white will just retreat the bishop, get castled, let white do whatever white's going to do, b6, develop, knight d7, get castled, bishop here, and you are quite happy with life. Look at that. Very, very level position. You're probably going to play c5 at some point, maybe after you've brought the rook across. Maybe you'll put a pawn here to stop a white knight landing on this square. But the game is very, very, very level. So that's another possibility. Not the only one that the good doctor gave us. Against d4 and knight f3 and other moves, he suggested we could play the Dutch defense, which is f5. And what was suggested was not the Dutch Leningrad or the classical Dutch with sort of these kinds of moves, but to go for the Stonewall Variation. What on earth am I talking about? Well, the Stonewall Variation in some move order involves putting 4 pawns like this, your bishop on either e7 or d6, depending on how the game develops. Just here, I'll just put it on d6 because I've got to put it somewhere. Castles, and then plonking a knight here, bringing the queen into the attack, probably this way. Although remember, if this bishop's developed to e2, then we might come to this square because there won't be a pawn here, and going for a kingside attack. Downside of this is this bishop can be a bit stuck, and if this bishop gets a bit stuck, so does the rook, but it's perfectly playable for black. Again, plus 0.5, not far off what you'd expect for white from an opening anyway, if they play sensibly. Okay, the slightest of advantages. So that's the Dutch Stonewall Variation. Okay, so that has taken us through very, very rapidly everything that Dr. Dave suggested. Now, I'm now going to give you one little bonus. All of those system openings that I just showed you as black, you can actually play them as white with the advantage of an extra move. For example, the Tarash setup as black is the queen's pawn, the king's pawn 1 square, and then the queen's bishop pawn 2 squares. So this. You could do this as black. For instance, let's just say here, absolutely nothing wrong with this. Look at the eval. Perfectly okay for white. This bishop isn't a huge problem because although it looks like it's blocked in, you can actually bring it out this way. You can play b3 and put it here. Once or twice in bullet games, I've actually gone there and there and brought the knight to d2. So it looks a bit odd, but it's okay. So you could do this. And you have the advantage over the variation where we play it as black of being a move ahead. So nothing wrong with it. You can play what I just showed you, the Tartakova system. So bishop here, bishop, castles, b3. Black's probably going to play c5 at some point. Bishop b2, knight c6 here. And again, perfectly level, and you've got the exact reverse of the Tartakova system, but just playing as white. Perfectly level game, nothing wrong with it. And all you've got to do is remember where the pieces go. Isn't that great? So you get to a nice safe middle game where you're obviously going to play here. You probably play here to stop a knight coming in. But a nice safe middle game with pretty much no effort except remembering where the pieces go. Love it. And it gets even better because if you really want to, you can play the Dutch defense in reverse as well. Now the computer won't like this one quite as much, but we can start with F4, the bird's opening. I doubt very much if many human opponents will know the from gambit, which can be a bit dangerous. They'll probably play here. And you'll probably go knight f3 and they'll develop, and you'll play e3 and they'll just play a developing move. And then you'll go d4 and they'll develop, and bishop d3 and maybe c5. And suddenly you've got the Stonewall in reverse, and it's saying the bird's opening Dutch variation. Computer says basically level. It thinks that black might have the tiniest of tiny edges. I can tell you that's just because this bishop, again, look, is stuck a little bit behind the wall of pawns. But this is okay. If you just want a slightly different system to play as white, this is fine. What are you going to do? Well, you're just going to get castled, and you're going to plop a piece here, probably bring the other knight into the game. You'll bring the queen maybe to here, maybe, oops, not like that because that'd be cheating. Maybe to here, although that bishop's a bit scary to do that in this position. Maybe to here if this knight's gone. I've had games where I play this where I just tuck the king in the corner and throw this pawn up the board. Rook can come up, rook can go across and target this square. So if you can get the bishop here, rook up, rook across, it's actually a pretty safe system. And actually, as the computer thinks about it more than more, look, it's just saying pretty much dead level chances for both sides. So that is it. You've got one opening set up for white and a move against pretty much all sensible responses. And if you feel like mixing it up, well, you can play the Tarash, or you can play our Tartakova setup, or you can play the Stonewall setup. You've got loads and loads of different openings now that you can play as white and as black. We've got against e4, we've got the French defense, and probably a relatively early c5, although again against this, just remember we're going to say here first, but get in c5 before the knight comes out. So you've got the French defense, and against pretty much everything else you've got the possibility of the Tarash setup, or if you want to be a little bit less confrontational, you've got the Tartakova setup. Oops, knight there. And finally, if you want to, against these things, you've got the Dutch Stonewall setup as well. So that is it. You should now have some kind of opening against pretty much everything that can possibly happen. And if you haven't already watched the other 30 odd videos, well, slowly but surely, if you work your way through, you'll see lots of quick games showing some of the ideas and some of the things that can go right and wrong for you playing these openings. So hopefully, if you follow through the whole series, thank you very, very much for that. Hope it was helpful and useful. The next thing I'm going to start doing is working on a remake of another book that Dr. Dave gave me, that initially when I was first doing these videos, I just did it by putting a PDF on the screen and talking through the moves. But now I've got the hang of using the analysis board and actually playing full games. I'm going to remake that and actually play through all of these miniature games. So that's going to be another quite long series for you, which hopefully again will help. But for now, again, thanks for watching. Hope it's been helpful, and see you next time.